Okay, so part two of perception and attention, or uh, visual attention, really, is first addressing this question of what determines where we fixate, where we're going to start with stimulus salience, or what's out in the environment, and then talk about cognitive factors, and then the nature of observers' tasks within a scene. As far as what determines where we fixate, starting with stimulus salience, this is often called visual salience. So something that is salient from the stimulus, or in this case, the visual environment, because we are talking about visual attention. This includes aspects of a scene like the color, brightnesses of colors, contrasts of colors, brightness in general. So if something is just more bright and light, that grabs our attention. Something that is contrasting, whether it is from red to green in these really contrasting colors, or contrasting in brightness. We see those changes take our attention, and also orientation. As you may have guessed by now, that we prefer vertical and horizontal orientations of lines. This is a very bottom-up explanation of what determines where we fixate. So bottom-up being starting with the stimulus and going through those early sensory and then subcortical, then putting it together. This is stimulus-driven, clearly. And I usually ask here for examples of each of these things. I did put a picture on this slide, so you do have something to look at and think about, but think about examples of each. I do want to give you a second to think about that. Something that draws your attention, either where you are now or some memory that you have of a particular scene. So stimulus salience, or visual salience, is one of the things that determines where we fixate, especially those first one or two fixations on a scene. And this is an example of a salience map. So people who are doing this kind of research, if we look at the picture above, they'll create a salience map, which is what you see below that, where you can see what is considered to be visually salient in the picture. And a lot of this, because we have these kind of beiges and blues and not really bright colors, a lot of the salience is happening where there is a contrast. So the clouds in the sky, the whiteness against the blue, the crest of the waves, so that white that separates really the beige from the blue, that whole little area, because there's so much change right there, that's salient, visually salient, and we're going to tend to look at it. And also there's a little pop of salience there at that island that's kind of far off, because it does contrast with what is around it. One thing we might refer to with visual salience or stimulus salience is something called attentional capture, when something really captures our attention. So if we're looking at this picture, if you look at this picture, the first place you look is probably somewhere in the center, and then what draws your eye? Well, for most of us, it's the guy wearing red, because all of those other people around him are in white or a really light blue, and so he has a lot, first of all, he has a lot of color, it's bright, and it contrasts. And so that really captures our attention. So on the next slide, I'm going to try and do this, online. What is the orientation of the line in the green circle? You ready? And try to do this as quickly as possible. And notice your experience is the important thing, because there's no comparison here. So what is the orientation of the line in the green circle? So for a lot of us, we might have had our attention pulled over to that red square because of the contrast and the brightness of red. Red is a very salient color. And so, as you can imagine, if that had been a green square instead of a red square, participants were faster to say horizontal, in this case, that the orientation of the line in the green circle is horizontal. They're faster to say that when there's no attentional capture. When there's this attentional capture of the red square, on average, people are slower to identify the orientation of the line in that circle. Another thing that determines where we fixate is cognitive factors. And now we're talking about a more top-down influence, right, of what our experience is and what our background knowledge and cognition tells us about scenes. So for example, a good example is a scene schema. Our prior knowledge about what is typically found within a particular scene, that can influence where we fixate and where we spend time fixating. And this is just one example of, there's been lots of research in this area. Vo and Henderson in 2009 found that people spent more time looking at the printer up at the top in this kitchen scene than at the pot down at the bottom in this kitchen scene. If we look, I'm going to start with the bottom. If we're looking at this kitchen scene, the pot is just another really expected item that belongs in this scene, which fits our scene schema. But if we look up at the top, that printer, once we figure out, hey, that's a printer on top of a stove, that does not fit within our scene schema, and we spend some time there because it's weird. And that is a cognitive factor. Another example of cognitive factors comes from an experiment by Shinoda et al., where they were, again, doing the eye tracking, and they had people doing this simulated driving on a computer, and they had people detecting stop signs. And so participants were more likely to detect the stop signs when they were actually at the intersections of roads. And so sometimes they would have a stop sign just in the middle of a sidewalk, and people, not only were they less likely to detect those, but as you can imagine, they're less likely to look at those, because where we are looking for stop signs is at the intersections of roads to see if there's a stop sign there. So this shows us that we learn from past experience, and it shows us something about semantic regularities, where semantic is something that is semantic is something that is meaningful, that these meaningful regularities, or these things that we commonly see in our environment that have a certain meaning for us, we expect them to, we expect things to make sense and to be where they should be, again, for a particular scene. And we do learn from our past experience. So clearly a top-down factor. Another cognitive factor is the observer's own interests and goals. So this is actually the picture he now has in the book showing saccades and fixations, where those little yellow dots are the fixations and the red lines are saccades. And you can see what a lot of us are going to do in this kind of picture is going to be what we see here, where we are looking at the different statues and maybe the water fixture, this kind of artistic part of what's in front of this building. But as you can imagine, if my interests were different, if I instead were a student of architecture, I might instead be looking more at the windows and the roof and different aspects of architecture instead of looking at this water fixture and these statues. This is a really classic study that was originally done by Yarbus in 1967. You can see down there, this says replication by James Brockmole, but I have taught from previous editions before James Brockmole became the second author on your textbook, and the data look very, very similar to these much more modern data. But this was an exploratory study, and what Yarbus was doing was showing Ilya Repin's An Unexpected Visitor while asking different questions and then just looking at where people's eye movements, where their fixations went. So if we look at A, that is the picture. B, they're asked to determine the ages of the people in the picture, and so you can see they're really looking at the faces quite a bit longer, maybe the posture a little bit. When asked in C to remember the clothing, you can see now they're looking much more at the clothing and much less at the faces. And then in D, when they're asked to remember the positions of the people and the objects, they're really looking all around the picture much more so than in the previous two. So this nicely shows how a person's particular goal, their task in a study, influences where their where they fixate and how long they spend there. Finally, I'm going to talk about the nature of the observer's tasks and the task-related knowledge that is important here. And so this nature of the observer's tasks, it kind of overlaps a bit with what I was just saying, but really those were the goals. It was the goal in the task. This picture in this study relates to how task-related knowledge and the task itself is driving a lot of these eye movements. So this was a camera-mounted eye tracker, and the person is, as you can see on the right, making a peanut butter sandwich. And what they do is they knead the bread, they look at the bread, they pull out the bread, they look across the plate, they find the peanut butter with their eyes, they look around to make sure, I guess they check something, and then the peanut butter. But when they're unscrewing the peanut butter lid, they're looking at that, and then they go and they look back at the bread when they need to spread the peanut butter. So this all seems really obvious of what we might do, but somebody had to do this study for us to say, yeah, that's of course what we do. What they found, though, was maybe it seems obvious, maybe not, that we had this kind of wait and see strategy. So the eye movement would occur just before we need the information that eye movement is going to provide us. Summarizing all of this so far, salience is important. It captures our attention. Cognitive factors are important. We have this scene schema. We have expectations from semantic regularities. But what's more important than what's in a scene is what a person is doing within that scene. So that my goals, my tasks, and my task-related knowledge, that can really drive my eye movements and where I fixate as well. Some of the benefits that we're going to see of attention is 1, it enhances our response to objects. 2, it enhances our perception of objects. And 3, it enhances the neural response that we see to particular objects. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about how attention enhances our response, or really makes us faster in our reaction times. This original research comes from a really classic study from Michael Posner and his colleagues back in 1978, where they had these valid trials. So you would see a cue like the arrow at the top and it's pointing to the right, and you would respond to the target. Sometimes that arrow was pointing to the left. On a valid trial, that cue is, as you're going to see in this example, the cue is pointing to the right and the target lands on the right. Okay, the person, their job is to fixate on that fixation cross and press a button when they see the target. 20% of the trials were invalid trials, so the cue would say the target's coming up at the left, for example, and instead the target would come up at the right. And as you can imagine, this was all nicely counterbalanced, where it was equally often on the right as on the left. The arrow was equally often pointing to the right or the left. What's important here is that the valid trials were valid most of the time, and they were pointing in the right direction, and the invalid trials, they were pointing in the wrong direction, and they were invalid, but just 20% of the time. And while this seems like you're probably saying, of course, that's what happened, but you have to do these studies before you know that this is what's going to happen. Information processing was more effective where their attention was allocated. So remember, their eyes are always on that fixation point, that fixation cross. So this is not necessarily where the eyes were fixated. This gets at a couple of things that we've brought up before. 1, we looked at this kind of research in the reaction time studies early on, and 2, this idea that we have this covert attention that is not necessarily the overt attention of where our eyes are fixating, and when we are paying attention to where our eyes are fixating. Posner and his colleagues back in 1978 talked quite a bit about how spatial attention works, and in this study they started talking about it as a spotlight of attention. So if that cue was valid, we are about 100 milliseconds faster to say, yes, we see the target, than if that cue was invalid. So we do have this kind of spatial spotlight of attention that is not necessarily just where our eyes are fixated. Eagley et al. In 1994 extended Posner's research by looking at pre-cueing within an object. And so I'm going to try to describe this as best I can. This is one example where you'd get a cue up at, let's say, A. And what you're saying, so you're looking at the fixation cross in the center, and your response is going to be to that dark shadow. When you see that target, that dark shadow come over in B. Now, if the cue came up at A and the target comes up at A, people were at 324 milliseconds. If the cue came up at A and the target came up at B, so down at the bottom of that figure, people were at 358 milliseconds. And if the cue came up at A and the target came up at C, people were at 374 milliseconds. So what they found was people were significantly faster at B when the target came up at B, even though they precisely measured such that B was the same distance from A as C. So they were faster at B than they were at C, because that what they were arguing was that this kind of attentional spotlight really spreads, so that they discovered this same object advantage. And now your author has a couple of even newer experiments that are looking at more realistic objects, where we see that we have this spotlight of attention, it enhances our response, and that spreads to whatever object is that where that attention is basically touching. So the second benefit was that attention enhances perception, and this is a study that shows this very nicely, this influence of attention on the appearance of objects. Carrasco et al. In 2004 had participants, so their task was to fixate on that center dot, and then a cue would flash, and the job is to, again, stay fixated on the center dot, but to indicate which of the orientations has a higher contrast. And so in C, you can see some example stimuli, and they were to say the orientation that's going to the left in this case, or the orientation that is going to the right in this case. Participants would see two grading stimuli, and the contrast of those grading stimuli would either be the same as each other or different from each other. If one of the grading stimuli had a higher contrast, there was no influence of the cue that was flashed. However, if those two stimuli had the same exact contrast, then attention appears to enhance the perception of contrast, as let's just say, as this picture is showing, the cue is flashed on the left, I'm looking at the fixation dot, and even though those two grading stimuli have the same contrast, I'm more likely to say the left has a higher contrast because my attention was already there. The final piece of this was that attention influences neural responding. So O'Craven et al. In 1999 did this study that is going to look familiar to the binocular rivalry study that I talked about earlier, but this was overlaid. The face and the house were overlaid, and these are just sample stimuli. People were told either attend to the house or attend to the face. And what we can see is in the fusiform face area, if they're attending to the face, there is a larger signal change, so there's more activity in the fusiform face area in comparison to when they are told to attend to the house. In the figure C, we're looking at the parahippocampal place area. So now, if the person is told to attend to the house, we see a higher signal change, so more activity in response to looking at the house than if they're focusing on the face. So we see this difference in the neural responding depending on what I'm paying attention to in this picture. There's a second example here of how attention influences neural responding. This comes from Data and Yo, working with people. They had people look at the center disk. So if you look over an A, that disk is what they're looking at, but they could then pay attention to either in that picture, the A, the B, or the C. And the researchers would tell them, now attend to B, which is kind of being shown in the thought bubble there. So attend to B, and I have this covert attention to B. And they were recording neural activity, and you can see in the B part of the figure, if I'm attending to A, I have that yellow hot spot. So a lot of the times how this works is blues and greens are low brain activity. And then as we get into, it depends on the study, but often it's red, there's higher neural activity, and then oranges and yellows. And yellows, in this case, in this example, is the hot spot where there's lots of neural activity. You can see over there in B that if I'm attending to A, while I'm looking at my fixation cross or dot, there's activity there close to the fixation. As I shift that attention down towards B, that attention, that neural responding shifts. And as I shift that attention farther towards C, we can look in the C part of that, that attention, that neural firing, the activity shifts even more down towards C. And this actually, as they told people what to do and where to attend, and then they recorded neural activity, it then allowed the researchers for prediction of where attention is. So they could tell the person, attend to where you want to, and let's just say the person would attend to B, and the researchers would see this activity that looks like the B part of B. This is really annoying online, but they would see this neural activity and say, you're attending to this section B, and they would be correct. They would be able to predict where the person was attending. And my final piece of how attention influences neural responding, it brings us to this really physiological approach to the binding problem, which we're going to actually have to get into, I think, in the next slideshow. And I'm debating actually waiting until Monday because I have so many fun demos that I really like. But the binding problem is really this question of how we are putting together all of the information of something, let's say like a rolling red ball, where it's rolling, it's moving, it's red, it's round. We have shape information in the temporal cortex. We have color information in V4. We have movement information in the medial temporal areas, and we have where that's happening up in the dorsal root. This is all happening in many areas of the brain. And so how does attention help us to really glue, if you remember that piece of it, that it's going to help us glue our world together? This is the binding problem and the binding question. And one of the things we see that looks like a physiological answer to this binding problem is a synchrony of firing. And so this is being shown in the Bozeman et al. 2012 study, where they were measuring local field potentials. So this is a lot like doing an EEG, except they'll have an electrode that is getting information from many neurons from underneath that electrode, which is really kind of true in an EEG, but we're looking at local field potentials. And you can see in the picture A, B, and C. Okay, and this was done with monkeys, and the monkeys were attending. Don't ask me how they got the monkeys to do all this and to know what the monkeys were thinking, but they had the monkeys look at, let's say, that blue fixation dot or green or whatever it is up in the left-hand corner, and they had the monkey either, again, give that covert attention to 1 or to 2. So to the to 1 where we have the yellow and the yellow and black oblique lines to the right, or to 2 with the blue and black oblique lines to the left. And what we're looking at here in brain activity is the local field potentials for sites A and C. Okay, so if you look over at the brain, A and C, where A and B are both in the visual cortex, and C is up in the infratemporal area where we're putting some of that information together, right? So if, as you see in the picture in B, there's no attention to stimulus 1, that's actually where electrode A is over, that is the electrode that's over where the local field potential would be recording for 1. And then we look at the activity for A and C, we can see that there is activity for both A and C, as we're seeing in the orange and green lines. But what you can also tell is that it's not synchronized. Okay, if the monkey is paying attention to stimulus 1, and I'm looking at, so electrode A is basically recording from where that monkey would be paying attention to now, what we see down in C in the bottom neural activity is that electrodes A and C are recording neural activity. Of course, there's always neural activity, so there's activity in the brain, but in this case now, they are synchronized with each other, and this synchrony of firing is a nice physiological response to or answer to the binding problem of how we are binding together these various features of the world. We're doing that with attention, and that affects the neural response in that it affects the synchrony of firing. And I hope that all came out okay, as I used to really bumble through that, and I still feel like this is my first time doing it online, actually, so it's kind of exciting. I hope that all came out okay, but plan to ask questions if you have questions. Okay, I'm going to stop here today, as this is getting us into the binding problem and how attention really acts as the glue, and we're going to go back into more behavioral and less neural examinations of these questions on Friday.